Uh, Excellent. I apologize if my voice is a bit warbly. I have been ill this week, but I wanted to welcome you all to our CHRA's webinar on the right to housing. I want to introduce myself. My name is Mel Willerth. I am the Senior Manager of Education for both the Canadian Housing Renewal Association as well as the Chartered Institute of Housing Canada. Both amazing organizations within Canada here that are trying to advance the cause of housing as a human right for everybody, that are, working on stewarding the next generation of housing professionals, that are advocating for more social housing. One of our goals is to kind of get to that 20% social housing in the next 20 years. And as we're growing and as the social housing landscape in Canada is changing, we are wanting to make sure that everybody is understanding some of the things that are at play. And with that, we have invited Dr. David DesBaillets today to do a webinar on what the right to housing is. Before we get started, I do just want to acknowledge that I am located in what is colonially known as Edmonton, or Amiskwaciwâskahikan, which is Treaty 6 territory here. It's the territory of the Plains Cree, the Nakota, and many Indigenous peoples for many years. And if you want to take a moment and share in the chat where you're from, whose land you're on, and just to kind of keep that in mind, especially the importance of it within the social housing landscape. I am going to turn this over to David. He's going to set you up on where we're going to go today. He's got an excellent introduction, and I'm really excited to see where the rest of this webinar takes us. Kenneth, can you admit people, please, while I'm sharing the screen?
Okay. Thank you so much, Mel. Thank you, Ken, for assisting me today with this presentation. I think we're good to go, so I'm going to get down to business here, and start with a little bit of an introduction. Of course, like Mel, I want to acknowledge that I am a settler on the traditional territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka, that is the Mohawk people, and members of the Haudenosaunee Confederation. My name is Dr. David Fried DesBaillets, and I'm based in Montreal, aka Tiohtià:ke, and my pronouns are he and him. And my affiliations, some of you may have heard of the Canadian Housing Evidence Collaborative. So that's one of the networks that I belong to, of housing scholars. I am also, the Czech is based at McMaster, I should say. I'm also affiliated with the Human Rights Research Education Center, and that's based out of University of Ottawa. And I formerly worked with the Office of the Federal Housing Advocate. J'aimerais aussi ajouter que si vous voulez poser des questions en français, inquiétez-vous pas, je suis prête à répondre à toutes les questions en français. Donc, with that being said, let us look at today's program. So slide number 2. And you will see a definition provided by the United Nations High Commissioner on Human Rights. But I like to start these things with a bit of a contentious question. And this is rhetorical, so I don't feel the need to answer. But question is, why do we study the right to housing? I mean, it's kind of nebulous. Does it have practical implications for housing professionals? And I'm assuming most of us here are housing professionals, or housers, if you prefer. So it's a question I've actually been asked, and sometimes at academic conferences, but at professional events as well. And it's not as straightforward as you might like. Uh, However, there is a short version and a long version, and the short version is that the federal government has enshrined the right to adequate housing in Canadian law through the National Housing Strategy Act in 2019, which states, and I'm quoting Section 4D, Canada must further the progressive realization of the right to adequate housing as recognized in the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. And we will be discussing the ICESCR a little bit later. But that doesn't quite answer our question because, well, Parliament passes laws all the time, and that doesn't always make meaningful or relevant impact on our everyday lives. So let me try a little bit more of a philosophical approach to this question. I would say that we study housing rights because we live in an advanced capitalist economy, which promotes rampant speculation in the housing markets, financialization and commodification of housing. And we're going to be, remember that word financialization, we're going to be looking at that in more detail later. Real estate transactions in Canada represent roughly 13% of our GDP. And it's one of the few areas of economic activity that actually turned a profit during COVID-19. So it's rock solid as economic and investment. It is one of those areas of the economy that just seems to grow and grow and grow. And I say this because what I just described to you are what we would call conventional benchmarks for success in housing. Things like GDP, property values, and so on. But we need a different benchmark here, one that doesn't ignore a very fundamental reality that each of us needs shelter to live, to work, and to function in our society. So human rights norms can serve as just such a benchmark, and especially in the community housing sector. Again, being a devil's advocate, what does the right to housing have to do with this? And I'm going to use
Welcome.
an acronym, the R2H. And instead of saying the right to housing every time, I'll just say R2H. There are countless laws in Canada that are overwhelmingly concerned with the protection of contracts and leases, property rights, mortgages, and so on. These laws don't necessarily prevent people from accessing housing, quite the opposite. We have anti-discrimination laws for tenants, for renters. We have regulations on when you can be evicted and how. And many would say we have enough laws governing housing. But when I speak of the housing right today, or the R2H this afternoon, I'm not talking about your lease, though that is an extremely important aspect of housing rights in Canada. But what I'm talking about is R2H as defined by international human rights instruments and the National Housing Strategy Act. And that R2H should never be reduced to a simplistic definition of material or physical needs. So in other words, you can't simply equate R2H with the roof over your head. R2H is bigger than that, and I'll explain to you why. But as you can see in that High Commissioner's definition, you're talking about safe, secure homes in communities that live in peace and in dignity, more than four walls and a roof. So I want you to keep that in mind. Now let's start the slide number three. And I'm going to give you a breakdown of my spiel today. Now, the CHRA approached me and asked me to write an R2H primer for their housing professionals mentorship program. This is a great program. Many of you are involved in, as am I. And what we're going to look at today is the actual primer hasn't been released, but we are going to look at the outline of the primer. So you're getting a bit of a sneak peek of what's coming in the pipeline. And then we're also going to look at the who, what, where, when, and why of how rather of R2H in Canada. We're going to look at R2H in the context of professional housing and development of housing in Canada. This is the part that I hope is going to resonate with your work. And the best practices in R2H is another essential theme today. We're going to talk about some of the areas where R2H is actually succeeding. And I know this is going to come as a surprise to some people, but it is actually producing good outcomes. Excuse me. Now, we're going to end with the scenario, R2H scenario. And this is something that I've pulled from the headlines. It's going to be a group discussion. We're going to break out into smaller groups to make it a little bit easier to have a discussion about this. And hopefully you're going to have an opportunity to apply some of the knowledge that we're sharing today and find ways to apply R2H to a real life example of housing rights in crisis. So with that being said, I am going to move on to slide number 4. And I wanted to just say that there will be about between 40 and 60 minutes of me blathering, and then we are going to do the scenario, which will take about roughly a half an hour, we hope. So altogether, it's 1.5 hours, and we hope that you guys can stick with us for the entire time. So slide number 4. As I said before, the heart of the R2H module that I wrote and am discussing today with you is a primer. And the primer is a sort of guide. It's meant to be practical. It's about current issues in R2H. It was designed for the CHRA for their professional mentorship program. And in it, we learn about fundamentals of R2H. So the links between housing policies and R2H, housing and homelessness crisis in Canada, value of R2H as a lens for better understanding the unique challenges in housing and homelessness, the design and application of better community housing models, as well as best practices in R2H throughout the community housing sector. The purpose of the guide is to help you as housing professionals develop tools and language, the language of R2H, for everyday use in your capacity as housers, as community builders, as responsibility holders. And that last one is one we're going to revisit later in the context of the human rights-based approach. So in the primer, we deal with issues like what R2H is, the basics of the law for R2H in Canada, what the human rights-based approach, or HRBA, is for housing, and how to implement R2H principles in your work. Slide number 5. This is the who, what, where, when, why, and how. So we'll start with who. R2H is a universal human right. And that means that according to international law, and specifically treaties signed by Canada's government and implemented through the National Housing Strategy Act in 2019, R2H is enjoyed by Canadians across jurisdictions.
Webinar.
So what R2H is? Well, it's defined by 7 elements. Now these 7 elements are something that you will see over and over again when you read about the right to housing. It is the UN Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights that developed this, general opinion number 4. And it breaks down the right to housing into 7 elements. And I'm going to go over those 7 elements with you right now very quickly. So number 1, we have security of tenure. And that basically means protection from eviction. I'm being a little bit overly simplistic, but that's essentially what it boils down to. Number 2, we have affordability. The cost of housing doesn't compromise access to other basic needs. So think of someone who's struggling to pay their rent as well as to pay for groceries. Number three, habitability. So this is housing in safe, healthy condition with enough space for everyone who lives there. Number four, accessibility for all. And this is especially for people with disabilities and members of traditionally marginalized groups. Number five is providing basic services and infrastructure, clean water, uh, electricity, protection from the elements, and so on. Number six, a location that is favorable to employment and to accessing basic social services. And finally, we have number seven, which is culturally appropriate. And this is this is one that is particularly important for Canada and the Indigenous context. So this deals with a culturally appropriate housing is designed and adapted to the life of inhabitants. It allows people to raise families in their communities in their own way. Of course, this is the general idea, the general concept behind R2H. Now, we need to ask ourselves, how are we doing in Canada according to these metrics? And I'm here to tell you it's not good news. We know, for instance, many individuals and communities in Canada, their housing doesn't meet these seven criteria. So, for example, 1.8 million households last year are living in housing that's unaffordable, in bad condition, too small, etc. We have more than 235,000 people experiencing homelessness in Canada each year. That's a very conservative estimate, by the way. We also have the Indigenous housing emergency. Many First Nations, Inuit, Métis, communities lacking clean water. Housing is overcrowded. It's deteriorating because it's inappropriate to the climate. It is not suitable to the culture. So adequate housing is a precondition for other human rights. You can think of the right to dignity, the right to have health, the right to life. And this is what I meant when I used that definition, that housing is more than just the roof over your head. In Canada, people with disabilities are often forced to live in housing that compromises their dignity and living in institutions because there's a lack of accessible housing with appropriate supports. Getting back to our list of questions, where can the right to housing be found? Well, the answer is every level of government in Canada has some housing rights. So we're talking federal, provincial, municipal, territorial, and Indigenous self-government band councils and so on. When? The international R2H dates to the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. Now, Canadian R2H is a little bit harder to pinpoint, and this is because even though the government adopted the Second Covenant, the ICESCR, in 1976, which includes the right to housing, it was only legislated in 2019. So it's the NHSA which really brought Canada's human rights obligations under international law to the domestic level. Why is a tough question, but if you understand R2H in a larger social economic context, you understand that it's an important element, maybe the essential element to full participation in society. A roof over our head, it makes almost everything we do possible. Physical, mental health, security, social and political participation, education, and so on. How? The how of R2H. The main foundations for housing rights in Canada remain under federal and provincial law. Provinces control property law. We'll talk about this a little bit more later. They have, of course, control over conveyancing and rent regulations and evictions and so on. They also have human rights codes, anti-discrimination laws, and so on. Federal institutions also play a part, and they have generally exercised their legal authority over housing in a variety of indirect ways, but these are no less important. And that includes things like the National Housing Strategy, the CMHC, Canada's Housing Plan, other federal funding mechanisms, and so on. Now, at the municipal level, you see municipalities playing an increasingly critical role in the delivery of R2H. And you can think of examples like innovations in zoning and also investments in housing first programs, in emergency shelters, and so on. Slide number 6. So we're talking here about, this is the slide that will give you a kind of a brief overview of policies, programs, and regulatory systems. I say brief because, of course, housing is a very complex and very localized issue that really varies a lot from one part of the country to another. But basically, we're talking about 3 overlapping legal orders for the realization of R2H. Again, federal, provincial, and municipal, and I should say territorial as well. At the federal level, you've got the primary legal mechanism for realizing R2H is the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, specifically Section 7, the right to life, liberty, and security of the person. And that's one that's been invoked in scores of cases, particularly with respect to protecting the rights of homeless individuals in encampments across Canada. There are many, many cases. The Adams case in 2008 is probably the most famous. Ottawa also, as I said before, recognized a progressive right to adequate housing. But this is not an individual legal right, and I really want to stress that. It's not a charter type right that you can go to court and claim. It is rather a federal mechanism designed for a gradual and very systemic, large scale changes to
Hi,
the
Sheila.
housing
How are you?
system. And it's designed to make housing more equitable
Oh,
over the long
yay!
run.
I'm glad.
At the
That's
provincial and the
really fun. It was
territorial
so nice.
level, we have R2H really overwhelmingly is governed by provincial regulations and human rights codes in Canada. There's also decisions by provincial courts and administrative legal bodies that are involved in mediating disputes, often between tenant and landlord. But the bulk of these rights are, they consist of protection against discrimination. So they deal with security of tenure, they deal with your rights and duties as a renter, they deal with preventing unlawful evictions. And of course, we have provincial legislation that provides administrative tribunals like the Ontario Landlord and Tenant Board with a mandate to settle disputes between renters and their landlords. Now, these examples may touch on human rights, but it's very, very rare. Based on what I've heard from lawyer friends, it's very, very rare for human rights concerns to come up, human rights arguments be used at the landlord tenant board. But nevertheless, discrimination and harassment of tenants, unsafe living conditions are all issues that relate to the R2H. Now, legally speaking, municipalities have very limited power. Cities don't really have that much power to enforce or to remedy R2H. They can, however, use certain tools like health and safety inspections to investigate R2H issues, such as inadequate, unsafe housing. And they also play a vital role in emergency shelters, safe consumption sites, investing in supportive housing, women's shelters for victims of R2H discrimination, and groups facing barriers to housing. And they also enact inclusionary zoning regulations in order to make housing more affordable and accessible, and to make neighborhoods more mixed. So that's the municipalities. Now, number 7, I think this is really the heart of what we're talking about today. I'd like to discuss with you how R2H can be relevant to your work as professionals. And I do think, despite the fact that many people don't really know what R2H is, um, they may be using R2H and not be aware of it. It does serve community housing providers and housing professionals in a number of ways. Think of it as a lens to analyze the housing crisis, or as a conceptual tool for addressing root causes of R2H issues. So this might become the basis for policies that are designed to improve people's living conditions, making certain groups a priority who have been historically discriminated against in the housing sector by putting them at the center of the process of housing development. So these are all ways that R2H can influence your work as a housing professional. And I'm going to give you a few specific examples. And this is not a comprehensive list. These are examples that are, I think, more commonly known. But for instance, using a gender-based analysis plus, and you probably know this is a federal requirement actually for all policymakers across the civil service, and that includes CMHC, to design programs that better meet the needs of women and other groups that have been systemically underserved in community housing and in social housing. Housing First programs are a great example of R2H in action. It's not always evident. It's not always explicit. It's not every organization will advertise that they have an R2H model, but by definition, Housing First is based on R2H. And if you think of giving people access to supportive housing, regardless of where they're at in their lives, whether they have agreed to addiction treatments or employment or skills training, that fundamentally is the right to housing in action. And finally, the FEBE, the for us, by us approach. We're going to look at this again in a little more detail later. And this is something that you see particularly in Indigenous housing. It's a model that's very popular. And basically it's an R2H approach to Indigenous housing. Housing has to be designed by Indigenous peoples for Indigenous peoples. So the human rights-based approach, HRBA for short, this is a conceptual framework adopted as a global standard by the UN, and we're talking 2003, so it's not new. And I also want to emphasize that it is not strictly a housing concept. It's a very general approach to human rights, internationally recognized human rights, so that it can actually be used in many, many different areas, including the right to education, the right to health, and so on. Basically, it aims to protect, fulfill, and promote human rights by integrating international human rights standards and principles into the housing development process. And I mentioned earlier responsibility holders. Well, that is one of the categories here. There's 3 categories created by the HRBA. One is rights holders. 2 is duty bearers, and 3 is responsibility holders. Let's start with rights holders. Simply put, everyone here is a rights holder. It's a very large category. However, HRBA does require that special attention be paid to members of marginalized groups subjected to discrimination, such as women, LGBTQ folks, people with disabilities, seniors, kids, immigrants, Indigenous peoples, racialized groups, communities, etc. Duty bearers. The primary duty bearer, according to HRBA, is the government, is state actors, federal agencies, provincial agencies, even crown corporations, that type of thing, which hold the highest level of accountability. However, human rights obligations can also attach to individuals and non-government actors. All of us have a general responsibility towards the community to respect human rights. And finally, we have responsibility holders, and this is the more ambiguous side of HRBA. Basically, we're talking about non-state actors. They have no legal obligation under international law to respect, protect, fulfill human rights, but they have an actual or potential influence on human rights problems and solutions faced by the community housing sector. So what are we talking about here? Think of landlords, think of nonprofits, think of real estate investment trusts or REITs. Now, how does HRBA model translate into the community housing sector? Well, HRBA approaches housing with 5 key principles. These are called PANEL, and that's the acronym for them. It's participation, accountability, non-discrimination, empowerment, legality. Those are the PANEL principles. Participation, this is key. Communities that are the target for housing development need to be part of the design and need to be consulted in a meaningful way and engage in a decision-making process at every stage of development. Accountability, there has to be a legal framework and mechanisms to ensure decision makers in housing respect their R2H obligations. Non-discrimination and equality, communities, individuals that are most vulnerable to housing crisis must be a priority for the community housing sector. Empowerment. Communities, individuals must be supported in the decision-making process so that they are not ignored by the housing providers. And legality. Communities, housing providers must ensure R2H enforcement mechanisms are in place and that regulations on access and discrimination are being respected when designing housing. And let's talk a little bit about best practices in HRBA. There's a few here. I'm gonna cite 3 examples of HRBA practice that I think is outstanding. And meaning, at the risk of sounding like a flatterer, CHRA is doing a fine job, I would argue, promoting R2H through its core values. The services to its members, so knowledge sharing, what we're doing today, for instance, is a type of HRBA. The Indigenous housing leadership, professional development, the mentorship program, advocacy. I know last week was Housing on the Hill. Some of you may have participated in that. So those are all examples of what I would consider best practices in HRBA. Now, we discussed earlier the Phoebe principle. I think the best example that I have come across of Phoebe is the Aboriginal Housing Mortgage Association. This is a BC-based organization that has done a tremendous job of promoting R2H. And I'm thinking of the BC Urban, Rural, and Northern Housing Strategy, for instance. This was introduced in part because the National Housing Strategy failed to address housing systemic rights violations experienced by Indigenous peoples. Finally, Toronto Community Housing it's the largest community housing provider in Canada. It provides an enforcement mechanism for which human rights issues, including R2H, can be identified and also remedied by tenants' human rights complaints. So there is a procedure in place that tenants can use to file complaints against landlords, managers, and so on. So we are almost ready to do our case study. But before we go there, I'm just going to very quickly review some of the literature on R2H. I understand that some of you will probably not have the time for this, but I wanted to give you just a very quick bibliography of sources that you can look at when you have time. And these are not academic papers. They are not peer-reviewed papers. They are accessible. They're not behind any paywall. And I think they give you some concrete examples of what we were talking about. So I talked about AMA, their BC First Urban, Rural, and Northern Indigenous Housing Strategy. This is an excellent policy paper. It's a good starting point for a discussion about designing an Indigenous housing strategy using for us, by us. And I urge you, if you're interested in seeing R2H in the Indigenous context, this is a very good place to start. Plugging my encyclopedia, Canadian encyclopedia entry here on housing rights. This is a very concise overview of the topic. It's a good place to just get an introduction to it. And it's a reliable source that is peer reviewed. It does provide citations. It provides links to other materials. It's available in French, and so on. So it's not open source like Wikipedia, which means that you can trust it as a source. So implementing the right to adequate housing under the National Housing Strategy Act. This is a very comprehensive study of the NHSA from an R2H standpoint, written by Canada's leading scholar on the subject, Bruce Porter. The National Protocol for Homeless Encampments in Canada. This is a time when homeless encampments are really growing. It's a phenomenon that we see everywhere in rural and in urban Canada. And this document really provides a HRBA approach developed by the UN Special Rapporteur, then Rapporteur Leilani Farha, and her colleague Caitlin Schwan. And there is input from many, many experts on this one. And it gives a concise and easy outline of 8 principles that should guide government actions and other stakeholders in adopting a rights-based response to encampments. So the literature review of the progressive realization of the right to housing, excuse me, this paper was commissioned by the National Housing Council, but this was in 2022. I worked on this with Bruce and Michelle Biss and Sahar Reza, and it was a literature review of all of the relevant research on progressive realization of the right to adequate housing, particular attention paid to implementation and avenues to progressively realize this right in the Canadian context. The human rights-based approach, we talked about the panel principle. I borrowed the panel principle from the Canadian Centre for Housing Rights, human rights-based approach to housing, the resource for tenant leaders. It's a report designed to help tenant leaders identify root causes of housing challenges, groups whose rights are most impacted by these challenges. And we're going to see an example of this, actually, in a moment. And this provides guiding tools. It helps you develop a rights-based housing solution. And it holds the idea being holding institutions accountable for implementing the right to housing. Now, I mentioned earlier, slide number 10, the scenario. And so I want to sort of briefly contextualize this for you. Can we get to slide number 10, please? Thanks. So, yeah. So basically, this is a recent example where housing rights have been threatened. And I thought it would be really useful for us to have a chance to sit down, read this, and I'm hoping it'll only take about 10 minutes to get through this text. It's about 400 words, maybe 500 words, and we can read it and hopefully sort of parse it to see where there are human rights issues potentially, and where these tenants' human rights are in jeopardy. And so I want everyone to sort of look at this as a kind of case study. And we're going to break out, I think, now into smaller groups to discuss it. But first, take 10 minutes. We've got plenty of time. And just read it from start to finish and try and have a critical mind as you're reading it. Look at these examples from real life. This is a case of the Thornhill. Some of you may already know the Thornhill Park rent strike, and which is, if I'm not mistaken, ongoing. And so we have a chance to apply some of the concepts that we talked about. So whether it's the 7 elements of the right to housing, or whether it's an HRBA approach to housing, we can use those as a lens to better understand this real life situation. So, Mel, are you there?
Yep, I'm here. Yeah, so I
Perfect.
put the link into the chat for
Okay.
everybody.
Mhm.
So you're able to read that. I'm going to break you out into breakout groups. Please be ready to share with everybody else. Point somebody in your group to share the questions. I'm going to put the questions up. Oh, I didn't put the questions on this one. Okay. I'll put the questions into the chat
Yeah,
so
good.
that everybody has them once we're done reading.
Mhm.
And we're going to give, I think, does 30 minutes sound good? Um,
For sure. For the discussion and the reading,
Discussion and
absolutely.
the reading. Yeah. Okay,
Yeah,
we'll give 30
agree.
minutes into the breakout groups, and I will put the questions into the chat that you should ask. So you should be reading right now as you're getting put into breakout groups, and make sure you sign somebody in your group, please, to report back to the group, because we're going to do that. I am going to stop recording now.